Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future with your host, Alan Pentz. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do. Introducing your host, Alan Pentz.
Hey, today we have an awesome guest from the Mercatus Center, Dean Ball. He is a research fellow there and a prolific writer on AI, regulation, and all things machine learning. So, Dean, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Right. So I was really intrigued just by, I think you've done some great work sort of from the, let's leave AI alone kind of camp, which quite frankly, I'm sort of in myself. So you were talking about the most recent California bill that has been in the press quite a bit, but you we're kind of saying, hey, there's some themes here that we kind of see across a lot of the regulatory efforts. I mean, there's 600 proposed bills across the country and the AI executive order from the Biden administration. So kind of what do you see as sort of the major themes you're seeing in this kind of legislation?
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple different things going on. You have a lot of concern about deepfakes and synthetic content. So we've seen a ton of state laws that have been proposed and a number have been passed that create the ability for people that are the victims of malicious deepfakes to sue the person who distributed or created that deepfake. Is sometimes in specific contexts, like non-consensual pornographic material. We've seen election-related deepfake laws. So that's like one big category. Another category that we've seen quite a bit of, at least talk about, is these algorithmic impact assessments, which is basically the idea of making either the developer of an AI model or the company that deploys that model perform so like anyone who uses it essentially, perform an impact assessment of, is this AI model discriminatory in some way? Does it discriminate against certain races? We've seen some stuff there. We've seen a bill pass in that regard. That would be Colorado, SB 205. That bill passed. A couple others came close. And then finally, you have this, like all those things are what I would call like a kind of like use or application-based regulation. And then though there's this other category of model-based regulation, right? So do we regulate the AI models themselves or do we regulate what people and businesses do with AI models? I advocate for the latter. I think that we should regulate what people do, not the models themselves. But there is a bill to regulate models. There's a few, but the most important one that has a real chance of passing, and I think is the most important AI policy debate in the world right now, it's happening in Sacramento, California. It's SB 1047. I can go into more detail on that bill, but that's kind of the broad sweep.
Why don't we talk a little bit about the major provisions? I know it's a pretty detailed piece of legislation, and there's been some recent modifications to the bill as well to lessen some of the concerns. But why don't you just give us a quick overview?
Yeah, so SB 1047 is introduced by a San Francisco state senator named Scott Wiener. And the basic idea behind the bill is to attach liability, civil liability to model developers for major harm that their models commit, that their models are used to enable. So if somebody uses a model made by OpenAI to commit a cyber attack that does more than $500 million of damage, the California Attorney General, obviously the person who did the cyber attack is, guilty of a major crime there. But under SB 1047, OpenAI would also be civilly liable for that harm. unless they comply with a bunch of very nebulous safety standards that are, currently described. It's the standard of reasonable care. What would a reasonable person have done? Which works in a lot of areas of the law. It's a little complicated for AI because AI is an emerging technology, a very fast moving field. And it's pretty hard to say what a reasonable person would do on something like frontier AI safety. So I think it creates a lot of uncertainty. And it puts the California government in the position of being able to issue a bunch of different guidelines and essentially serve as a de facto regulator. They wouldn't be a literal regulator. They wouldn't be able to say, you're not allowed to make a model if it doesn't meet these safety standards. They wouldn't have that legal authority. But as a practical matter, they might just have that authority. To at least at the frontier, these very expensive large models would sort of put the California government in that position. So there's a bunch of other things the bill does, but that's the crux of it.
And then I guess the main other thing not main, but one of the big other things was that this bill created or called for the creation of some sort of model bureaucracy, right? That would have overseen this. And in the new version of the legislation, it calls for a board. So there would be some kind of like actual group of people beyond the attorney general of the state whose job it was to oversee this.
Yeah, there was originally going to be a regulator called the Frontier Model Division. They removed that in the most recent amendments, but they essentially just put many of the functions that the Frontier Model Division was supposed to serve are now just served by different bureaucracies that don't have a dedicated name for them. They're just part of the California I think it's called GovOps, the Government Operations Agency of the California government. So they would have to hire, new bureaucrats to do that for sure. Probably in the long run, not a ton of them, but a reasonable number of them, maybe 24 or so. And yeah, they would be issuing those regulations. And this, just to be clear, like this is a regulator. This would be a kind of regulator. It's like a part of the California government that does like it's like HR and IT. It's like internal functions for the California government that's just also regulating like the frontier of AI. And I just think that's kind of crazy personally. I think that's like an absolutely terrible institutional structure.
So that's sort of a GSA, like a General Services Administration at the federal level, right? And then what I would assume is sort of the mechanism for, I guess we say regulation in quotes because they actually aren't a regulator, would be these safety and security plans, right? That they would have to have done some kind of safety and security plan before. And if that safety and security plan was done with reasonable care, which you have indicated, it's very difficult to tell. Supposedly you're safe if it was done with reasonable care. But if, it was not, then you could get injunctive relief and damages. Is that your understanding of like the main mechanism they would use to kind of, enforce some kind of standards, right, across the models?
Yeah. And of course, they can certainly bring an investigation against you and, sort of like take you to court, even if they don't win, they can wrap you up in years of litigation and, discovery and subpoenas and all that kind of stuff. Very, very conceivable.
Right. So one of the concerns I've highlighted on the podcast when I was talking to the European side, when it feels like California kind of wants to play the role of the EU here and be the world regulator, right? So was this, what it does essentially is enshrine the current incumbents who can't afford to litigate, go through all the but somebody coming up, wouldn't have those kind of resources. Now, in some ways it might enshrine incumbents, right, and prevent. So in some ways they might support it, right?
In some ways, I do think it's fair though. Like one thing to be fair to the SB 1047 supporters is that there is a dollar threshold that is fixed in statute. So you have to be training $100 million model for SB 1047 to apply to you. It has to be at least $100 million. So I think any company that is devoting $100 million of like compute to training a model, probably has, could still be a relatively small company, but, ostensibly they have the resources to engage in that litigation if they need to.
So this brings me in a little bit of, we were talking before we got on about Zvi Moskowitz, who has a great Substack called Don't Worry About the Vase. He's a very pro AI regulation, I would say, but kind of in maybe a smarter way than I've heard a lot of other people. Okay, so he would have a couple of pushbacks here, right? So first, you mentioned, hey, it's $100 million, right? If it costs $500,000 to go through this SSP process and kind of through all the stuff around it, hey, that's a small percentage of your total compute cost, right? But there's also this idea that say you've got Llama, right, an open source model. There's also a provision that says, hey, if you spend $10 million to fine tune a model like that, you also are subject to this injunctive relief. And that seems to me like a much lower threshold. You don't have to as I understand it, you don't have to have done both. So 10 million, we're not talking about a huge amount of money here obviously in the scheme of my personal life, that's a large amount of money, but in the scheme of AI funding, not that much. So if you think about sort of the idea of the ecosystem, the business ecosystem going forward is, there's a lot of thought of somebody like Llama putting these models out there, and then most, just like that would be like Apple putting out the iPhone, right? And then iOS, and then everyone's developing applications based on that platform. So you're talking about this regulator now can regulate the entire application ecosystem around AI, as long as you spent $10 million or more, which seems like a very low.
Yeah. And the compliance costs are essentially, they're very difficult to estimate. If there is some best practice that emerges that's extremely expensive to do, and the California government decides that that's what they want everyone to be doing, and they're going to recommend that as a guideline, well, then, that alone could cost, could be millions of dollars, to just implement that. So we don't know. And I think that's really the fundamental problem with this bill, is that it's just premature. And there's so much uncertainty in the field right now that I just worry about, creating more uncertainty through a law, right? Creating legal uncertainty on top of all the technical uncertainty and socio-technical uncertainty that we're already facing with AI.
So what do you think that is? Like, there were books supposedly back in the day when personal computers came out about how PCs were like evil and stuff, right? So it wasn't like there was no like doomer feeling, but I don't think there were a lot of efforts to, there weren't 600 bills across all these states trying to regulate it. So why are we in this, like AI really hasn't caused any problems. It's all potential, right? And when I try to get ChatGPT to do certain things, I kind of laugh. Like, I don't think this is some kind of system that's going to bring down the world, like creator of the world's business and governments. Like, come on, we're not there. And, a lot of discussion about when that'll happen. But I think some of the early estimates were a little ridiculous, right? This isn't happening next year. So what do you think it is? Like, why are we this far down the road?
Well, it's basically two things. I think the first thing is that there is a general sentiment. I don't believe it's correct, but there is a sentiment that a lot of that I hear policymakers and policy adjacent experts often make, that we got the internet wrong. That there's some law, if only we had done something about social media or about privacy or about smartphones, about the internet more broadly, then XYZ problem that we face today wouldn't be there. So for people on the left of center, I think this really started with the election of Trump in 2016, which they largely blame on social media. They tried to pin the blame for that loss on Meta in particular. And I think Meta let them do that. Meta took more responsibility than they should have. So they legitimize this narrative, in other words. And, for, I think, right of center people, it has more to do with the mental health of children, social media, like that mentality, I think. And there's some idea that there was something, if only we had seen these risks earlier and acted on them, then we could have dealt with them. And I don't actually think that's true. I think you can debate whether or not the internet is causing these problems that we're seeing in the world. I think that's like the first thing you could debate on the merits. But you could also have a debate about, is there a law you could have passed that could have actually done anything about this problem? And I think the answer to both of those things is no, by the way. So there's that feeling of like, we messed up. We missed the boat on regulating these things. And now they're causing all these problems. And we don't want that to happen with AI. There's that. And then there's also like all the debates that happen in the AI community about like the trajectories the technology could take and all of this sort of thing are like interesting debates. And I love engaging in them. But I also think that on some level, the totally uninformed man on the street actually might have like the somewhat more directionally accurate take, which is like, hey, this ChatGPT thing looks pretty smart. If it keeps getting smarter, that would be very different. That would be a very different state of the world. If this thing were like as smart as us or smarter than us, that would create a lot of interesting new problems, maybe a lot of interesting new opportunities, but interesting new problems. And so there is a sense, and I think it's a legitimate sense that, sort of AI as a transformative technology is different from many of these other, things, things like the internet and smartphones and stuff, and that we actually do need to apply a different level of caution to AI. To some extent, I think that is not entirely inaccurate. I disagree with the decision to regulate now, but I actually do think that having a little bit of being aware of what we're doing.
So I call the first problem Germany, basically, and the EU, right? And talking to them, they do. I talked to the German AI advisor to the German Parliament, and he was basically like, I gave him a example of like, or from the EU legislation, and I said, hey, like if you had Gmail when it came out, and it had to go through this review process that you want to have, Microsoft would have been lobbying the EU to delay that and say things like, hey, Gmail's got big file sizes, so they could attach nuclear bomb plans to this. So this is dangerous, right? And then it never would have come out. And his response was, yeah, but they read your emails, so they're terrible. So that would have been a good thing. And I was like, hey, you could pay $10 a month and they don't do that. And then you don't have to deal with it. And he just didn't care. So, I mean, I think that side, I just don't agree with that. I think they're wrong. I think on the second side, you have a point. And, but like, look, it's not nuclear weapons, right? Like, we needed to come after nuclear weapons and regulate them from the very beginning because they blew up cities. Now, maybe AI isn't the PC, right, where it's pretty neutral and maybe you can come up with some bad cases, but it seems pretty ridiculous. It's somewhere in between those two, right? So I guess the point I would make, I think you agree with, is like, hey, let's observe this and yes, be ready to do stuff, but let's not like, murder the baby in the cradle here either.
The ultimate question really boils down to is like, are we on a truly exponential increase in capabilities? So, will language models continue to progress exponentially, or will they reach asymptotes? Will they reach limits where they just get, we invest 10 million or 100 million or $1 billion more dollars and they get 10% better instead of getting 500% better? I don't think we know. I think that certainly the last 2 years, since ChatGPT, the models have gotten much better. We've gotten way cheaper, right? Like 100 times cheaper, significantly better. at least as we, to the best of our ability to measure these things. But at the same time, ChatGPT can't do something fundamentally different from what it could do 2 years ago. So, the case right now is like, oh, well, this kind of looks asymptotic, right? This looks like, well, they're spending more money, they're making bigger models, and, they're getting better incrementally, but they're not improving, super dramatically, in a way that like is going to shock the general public. On the other hand, a lot of people would say, well, you just haven't seen, these have all been the previous generation. Right now, we're all using models that were trained in 2022. And so, when the next generation comes out, which should be, I think, by the end of this year or early next year, when that next generation comes, let's see, and if we're truly on an exponential trajectory, then we should expect that GPT-5 is a bigger leap from GPT-4 than GPT-4 was over GPT-3. Because that would be the nature of the exponential. We should expect that. And if that doesn't happen, then I think we'll, have some indication of where things are headed. I think either way, it'll be really, really valuable. I think we'll know in the next few months, we'll have a much better sense of what we're dealing with than we currently do.
Yeah, so we need to look at that second derivative, right? The rate of change, like how fast is it increasing, right? That's significant. Do we have a Moore's law type thing here? Is it a diminishing returns type thing? Those are, I think, great points. So I want to go back a little bit just to give Zvi his due, because I want to be fair to his point. And I think his other thing was, hey, look, you're liable today if your thing goes out and does something bad, right? So at least the California legislation gives you some surety of like what the penalties are. And you could actually cost that out. So how do you look at that? Like, to me, again, that's like an incumbent relief measure, not great for new people coming in. But anyway, how do you see it?
That is something that a lot of SB 1047 supporters have said. The author of the bill, Scott Wiener, has also said that. He's made the point that AI developers actually have way more liability under current common law than they do than they would under SB 1047. Problem with that is that I'm not sure it's true. I guess at a really fundamental, deep level, I think it's been pretty hard to bring negligence, and reasonable care liability types of cases against software developers. If a software developer has a bug that causes a company to lose a bunch of money or something, that generally speaking is not something you can sue the software developer for. And that has to do with sort of the way that courts internalize software, starting in the 80s and 90s. It has to do with the fact that software licenses very frequently have liability waivers for the developer. Those are all things pointing in the direction of, well, the status quo is that it's actually very hard to attach liability to software. And if courts broadly internalize AI as another kind of software, then that might continue to be the case, So I think that when you say AI, now courts could also not, right? Courts could also internalize AI and say they could treat it differently than software. They certainly could do that. But when you say that under existing law, AI developers have a lot of liability right now, you are making assumptions about the way, not you personally, but one is making assumptions about the way that courts will think about AI.
I think you did some good writing, I think it was this week or last week, on sort of the agent model of AI, right? And how I thought it was interesting to think, there is a bunch of law out there. Like, a lot of people are worried about AI agents going out and doing things. And I think you cite a example where it's like, hey, I want you go to, Devon or whatever the newest thing is. And you say, hey, book me a ticket to go to Boston, and a plane ticket. And it could go to the website and go to Expedia or to US Air or to American Airlines or something and book you a ticket. Or it could set in motion a plan to kidnap the CEO of American Airlines until they meet your demand to fly you to Boston, right? And so like theoretically, this thing could do either thing, right? And would you be liable? How would you be liable and things like that? So talk a lot. I thought it was kind of an interesting thing I hadn't heard before.
Yeah. So because of SB 1047 and just generally like, there has been a lot of conversation on liability for AI. I think that the answer to liability is probably not that the AI model developer should never have liability. I think they probably should. It's just a question of how we define it, right? So when a car gets into an accident, right? Let's say I'm driving and I hit a pedestrian. If I was, on my phone and not paying attention and I hit the pedestrian, well, then I'm legally responsible for that. If on the other hand, my car is well maintained and its brakes fail, well, then that's not on me, right? Like assuming I've been taking good care of my car, if the brakes fail, that's on the person who made the brakes. It's on the person who made the car. The reason that that's tangible as a liability standard, why that's coherent, is that we have a good sense of what it is for a car's brakes to fail. Or, we know what a functioning car is, and we know it actually in like a pretty concrete legal sense. We don't have that sense for an AI model. And it's like very hard if we're talking about like AGI, it's like very hard to imagine how you would even craft such a thing, like a technical standard that defines what well-functioning AGI is. It's, it's the everything machine. How could you possibly write a, legal standard? So yeah, this was an idea where basically my thought was, we can use concepts from the common law, that have been applied like in employment situations. So this is an area called agency law. And basically the idea is when I hire a person to do something for me, whether as a full-time employee or part-time or whatever, I am designating them an agent, of mine. And there are many expectations that are implicit that I don't need to spell out in a contract that come from the common law about the reasonable care that you should take, right? Fiduciary duties to me. So if I direct you to spend money on my behalf, for example, to invest money for me, there's a fiduciary standard that's written into the common law that kind of sets out the expectations for the level of responsibility that you'll demonstrate with my money. And it seems to me that law of this kind with a few tweaks is probably a good starting point for what we will be designating, what we will be tasking AI with. I mean, after all, the next generation of AI, that everyone's pushing towards are called agents. There already are agents out there, models that can go out and do things on your behalf. I do think that what we'll see more of that'll be fascinating to see how quickly that develops. Is it going to be like self-driving cars where we think we got it, we think we have it, but actually they're not reliable enough to really work. And it's going to take, we get 98% of the way there, but then that last 2% takes 15 years. Is it going to be like that? Or is it going to be quicker? Hard to know at this point, but I do think the capabilities like that are coming. And I think we need a legal, a legal framework for dealing with this. It seems to me that a top-down regulatory framework where you just design a liability regime from scratch is just probably not going to work because the technology is too general purpose and too complicated for people to be able to kind of rationally write down all the liability rules and get that right. I just don't think that's going to happen.
What if you had an SSP approved by the California board that protected you, right? Would be the other come back, I guess, right? In that case, would that be helpful, right?
The idea behind SB 1047, and I think that the question there is a really interesting one, which is a model doing something unsafe? At the end of the day, code is just code, right? I can write code to develop an app that people love, or I can write code to bring down a electricity grid, right? I can do both of those things with the same general purpose tool. So an AI model that writes code to bring down the electricity grid is in some sense not misfunctioning, right? Like it's writing code. And if it's able to bring down the electricity grid, it's probably doing a pretty darn good job. of writing code. But obviously we don't want models to be able to do that, right? Like we do want there to be some degree of like safety limitation that keeps them from being able to do that. But the question is that if someone gets around those safety limitations, is that like a defect for liability purposes of the model? Or is that just like on the person who got around the safety limitations and committed a crime? Or is everything bad that a model does a defect of the model? It seems like, and that's not, SB 1047 is not saying everything bad that a model does is a defect of the model. It's saying some very serious harms are a defect of the model. And I think that question is like a valid debate to have. In my mind, something like SB 1047 is pushing in an unrealistic direction, which is essentially perfection. It's essentially the idea that like, if this tool can possibly be used by someone else with very nefarious intent, some very clever person with malicious intent, that's somehow the responsibility of the person who made the tool. I just don't think so. I just don't think that should be the case.
Given that AI is a general purpose technology, it seems like this kind of regulation is more problematic, right? Because again, we can go back to nuclear weapons. It's pretty clear, obviously you have nuclear energy and then you have weapons, and you can regulate the uses of both because you know what they're going to get used for. And with a computer, it's pretty tough, right? Or with a piece of code, so I just think we have to have a lot more epistemic humility, I guess is the term I would use. Like we have to have a little humility about what we could actually, and like the unintended consequences of what we're doing, given that it's a general purpose technology. And the people whose lives are going to get saved because AI did something to invent a drug or figure out a better way to, or make us richer, those people aren't at the table right now. And we got to have some humility about, about those benefits that can be created.
I think, yeah. And in fact, so in my view, there's kind of three approaches you can take to AI regulation. You can do the model-based regulation, which is what we've been talking about. There's what I call use-based regulation. The EU's AI Act is mostly an example of this, I think, where basically what you do is you take AI and you look at it in every industrial context, right? You say like AI in healthcare and AI in banking and AI in construction, whatever else. And you create normative standards for the use of AI in every industry. And you just kind of go industry by industry and you make rules. And then the last one is what I call conduct-based regulation, which is starting with the assumption that our existing laws codify the behavior that we want people and companies to have in the world, right? This is how we want you to behave. These are our normative standards. They're ethical standards, that are coded into our laws in a million different ways. And we start with that assumption, in other words, that our laws do a pretty good job of codifying how we want people to conduct themselves already. And we take a technology neutral approach. We say, well, it doesn't matter. If you committed fraud, it doesn't matter if you committed fraud with AI or not. What matters is that you committed fraud. And you could do it with nanotechnology or AI or, Stone Age technology. It doesn't matter. The point is the crime is fraud. And I think that if you start with that assumption and then kind of work from it, so might be that, okay, well, there are actually some exceptions. There are areas of the law where AI doesn't apply and where we'd like, the law to apply to AI. Okay, well, then write those exceptions, right? Like make those tweaks to the law. Or maybe there are areas of the law where it's the opposite, where the law creates stupid barriers to using AI that we actually don't want. I'll give you an example of this. There are cities in America that have restrictions on the hours that certain kinds of businesses can be open. So it might be like, if you're, blah, 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 professional services business, you can't be open in this town. If you're a law firm, let's say, you can't be open in this town on Saturdays or Sundays or something. Well, that's fine. But that law probably wasn't anticipating the idea that it might be possible to have like an AI customer service agent on call 24 hours a day to respond to anything that comes in. And like, of course, we want that to be able to be the case, right? Like, of course, that's desirable. So that would be an example of somewhere where we actually need to sort of cut back that law or make an exception for AI. And I think that work is ultimately just painstaking and really hard and issue by issue. And it's not the kind of thing that's susceptible to one giant piece of legislation that you pass, one landmark bill, and it's not sexy, and it's not going to get any legislator awards for their bold leadership and technology policy. But I also think that it's, for the most part, the job to be done, the actual job that we should be doing.
Very similar to kind of like common law, right? Where you're building slowly over time this edifice of decisions that are made. A lot of them tactical. Maybe there's some exceptions that need to be codified in the law.
I think to the extent that you regulate a general purpose technology, that's really the way to do it. And not so much by these other kind of more rationalistic methods.
Gotcha. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about actually using AI instead of regulating it, which is probably the better thing. So on this podcast, we focus on government. And so just my assessment has been, it doesn't matter how much things advance. Like, we're not using AI at all. We're using like 10% or less of the capability of AI because people just don't use it. I have it for employees. We've been running pilots, trying to get people to use it. I mean, we've got a few, and I would say, maybe there's like 5% uptake. I think that's the reality with technology. It's a little depressing sometimes, but it is, I think, what the reality is. And then much less like our government clients. My God, like, it's a fear-based mentality now where it's mostly, like how we're going to get in trouble using AI. Now, I always say that flips pretty quickly when maybe a new administration comes in, they come up with a mandate to actually use it. Then all of a sudden, everybody wants their AI project. But I don't know. My sense is that it's going to take a while for it to come in. And I think the way it's going to come in is embedding into the workflow of existing SaaS software. And not in the way that Microsoft's done it so far, where you have a co-pilot. It's got to be in the workflow. So it's got to be in your HR software, and it does something, and it's not like a separate thing you go to, right? One, I'd be curious just your thoughts around, hey, how do you see adoption? Where do you see it? And then maybe we talk a little bit about maybe some of the ways that government could employ it when they do start their AI projects.
Yeah. So first of all, I completely agree with you that adoption, what economists call technology diffusion, is the really important thing here with AI. Innovations don't matter very much if they're not used. The fact that the iPhone existed in a lab in Cupertino, California is cool, but not ultimately a world historical event. What's world historical is that 1 billion people use iPhones, and obviously many more billions use Android phones that are the same design as the iPhone. So I think that that's like, deeply important. I guess, yeah, I don't think we have very good data on how businesses are using AI. I wish we did. This is the kind of thing I support government efforts to measure this better. There's a bill in Congress called the Automate Act that I think is pretty smart. I can't endorse legislation. I'm a nonprofit employee, but like, I think it's a pretty smart move to be able to have some quantitative estimates of how AI is being used in different business contexts. The way I kind of think about it is Ben Thompson put it this way recently. Ben Thompson of Stratechery, and I think this is smart, is the developers, like software developers, have pretty sophisticated tooling that they have like the wherewithal and the incentive to build. So like if a bug gets filed in some software code base that they have, oftentimes they have automated, pre-AI, automated tooling that can like figure out the part of the code where we're talking about and like pull that up and sort of just like accelerate like finding information for them. And I think that the there's like this slow process that has to take place of doing that for all knowledge work, right? Kind of just like building that through and kind of like giving knowledge workers the same kind of automation and sophisticated tooling that software developers had for, a little while now. So I think that that's kind of like one of the ways it could shake out. Of course, the great thing about diffusion is that people are creative and people find millions of different ways. I think one other thought I have on this is like, it seems to me that smaller entities and individuals are at a bit of an advantage with AI use than are medium and large size corporations, because the medium and large size corporations are likely to have much more defined business processes that need to be like deterministic, and AI is not deterministic, right? LLMs are probabilistic. And so like it could just be, it could be complicated and difficult to integrate into those kinds of workflows. Whereas like I am just an individual, and if I want to use AI, I don't have any defined business processes. I'm just a guy. And so I can use it to my advantage. Whereas I think to a lot of the work that people do in larger corporations is as part of this sort of like knowledge digital assembly line. And it's harder to integrate AI into like a live assembly line when it could mess stuff up. So I think businesses are doing it. I just listened to a great interview with like the chief information officer of Goldman Sachs, who was talking about, it was Odd Lots, about how they're integrating AI. It was a very illuminating conversation. But yeah, I think we're in the super early days for sure. On the policy side of things, I think that there's a lot regulation can do that harms diffusion, especially like these algorithmic impact assessments where, any business that wants to use AI all of a sudden has to like figure out whether or not a language model is racist. It's just complicated. That's just hard work to do. I really don't care in a lot of ways, like my local plumber, whether or not he does an algorithmic impact assessment to see if the LLM he's using to help him write bids for customers somehow racist. I just don't see that as being a useful application of public policy to technology. So yeah, that would be an example of how you can harm diffusion. There's a lot government can do though to help. Part of that is just by experimenting itself with AI and its own processes, internal processes, and like sharing best practices, sharing things, right? Like government's a big user of these things. Government has a lot of processes. At the same time, a lot of government paperwork is highly structured, very, easy to pattern match, and LLMs eat that kind of thing for breakfast. I think that the government is like a particularly good client for AI in many ways. So yeah, I think they could be a leader if they wanted to. I'm not aware of any states that are, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
My take is, number one, customer service, and just so many people are coming to government websites to find a piece of information. And, the ability of AI to just cut through, like I was talking to a guy who works on the help desk for sam.gov, where you have to register if you're going to do business with the government. And he mocked up a chat bot using all the publicly available help desk articles. And by the way, a help inquiry to sam.gov, maybe 45 days to get an answer from them. Something like that. Maybe it's better now. I don't know. But that at the time it was like that. And so, so he had a simple question like, oh, someone had asked me, do I need a cage code, which is a identifier from the government for a business to do business with the government? And you go search that on their help desk at that time, and it's like 10 articles. You have to hunt and peck through them. None of them actually answer the question, right? But they have pieces of information about it. Yeah, it's a chatbot, and it's like, no, not unless you have you need to do secured work or something like that, I think was the answer. Don't quote me on that. This is a few months ago, but it was like immediately answer the question, and then you can link back to the sources, right, to ensure that it's not hallucinating, and you can force it to only answer from the documents, right? And it was like, oh my God, that could have been a 45-day inquiry that never would have gotten answered. And we answered it like that. So to me, the fact that we haven't gotten that rolled out, that's like super low hanging fruit, right? And then you go on from there to increasingly sophisticated. But just even in the policy process, I just think that like the amount of data the government, like in a regulatory process where they're taking in comments and there are different pieces of legislation out there, and like just that massive amount of information is just unwieldy. Or we look at it, we do a lot of work in grant programs. It's like, my God, like these people having to apply for grants at the state and local level, there's just so much regulatory stuff around it. The fact that you just have a chatbot that could tell you exactly what to do and be like, all right, can I do this? No. Oh, can I do this? Yes, do it this way, right? I mean, it would be amazing. So I see that just in those customer service factors is really low. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's many different things one can imagine. And I know a lot of governments are trying and experimenting. And it's certainly, like I don't envy the people that are trying to do that. I've written a report that's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks that is about like how I think governments should kind of like set up the institutional design to lead in adoption. Because I think one of the problems that you have, there's this idea of like chief AI officer, right? The problem with that is that oftentimes the chief AI officer will, in practice, unless you take careful care to mitigate against this, what will happen in practice is that the chief AI officer will become the chief AI worrier. And there'll be the AI cop. And it's like, if you're not using the right version of ChatGPT, the AI cop is going to come after you and, all this kind of stuff. And I think what you need to do if you're setting up the design here is like chief AI officer is the person who drives forward AI adoption within a government agency. And you assume that the rest of the agency, just the institutional momentum, all that will push back and, like all the risks will be considered by the simple fact that government agencies are risk averse. And what you actually need a chief AI officer to do is be the person who's really incentivized to drive forward adoption and change within the organization. So I've thought a little bit about that.
How do you do it? Can you preview a little bit?
I think it's mostly just about like, how do you assess the success of of a chief AI officer? And I think you do it, by metrics like hours of time saved, money saved, customers served, you know what I mean? Like processes improved, things like that. You just have, and obviously with metrics, you got to be careful because people game the metrics. That's an inevitable part of life. But I think that like pushing in that direction of we assess your impact, not by how many risks you mitigated, but instead by how many positive adoptions you drove. I think that's the right direction.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is, with the exception of the sort of the national security state and the R&D functions, where those are really pushed out of government, you're going to see government probably adopt whatever the commercial standard is, right? So whatever Goldman and whatever the Harvard Business Review writes up as the right way to have AI integrated in your organization, who should run it, and what the measures are beyond, I guess, profit. You'll see that because I think it'll be adopted probably pretty similar to the cloud. So that means 5 years later, and it'll just take longer, right?
One of the risks I think that we have with government adoption of AI is that it's underappreciated. I'm generally like a classical liberal, and a lot of regulation concerns me, and I think the possibility of overregulating is very real with all things. But government itself is overregulated in America. The number of rules that a government employee or an agency are under is just so crazy that I think a very real risk for government is over-regulating its own use of AI. We've seen this at the federal level. The Biden OMB, Office of Management and Budget, has issued guidelines for federal agency use of AI. It's all the federal agencies except for intelligence community and national security. They are exempt, as is often the case. They're exempt. They can do whatever they want. But all the other agencies have to abide by these rules that involve huge amounts of risk mitigation. And it's not that there should be none, because, government services are essential and there are constitutional things about due process and serving people equally and things like that, right? Like, that's very serious. We should take that super seriously. At the same time, it's very possible to overregulate government's own use. And I worry about that because I think government's already behind in 1,000 different ways technologically and is already way too slow. The history is moving faster and faster, it feels like. So got to be careful there.
My theme is always, or my saying was, not that government's not accountable. It's too accountable. I mean, it's accountable to so many different things and so many different people that it can't accomplish anything, right?
We might well have too much accountability and transparency in our government, certain parts of it at least. I totally agree.
And I do think that what worries me, well, and this will be the forcing function as well, right, is, hey, everyone else is going to be using AI and they're just going to flood the government, right? So now you can flood it with proposals for contracts. You can flood it with court cases. You can flood it with regulatory comments. You could flood it with blah, 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 right? Even the FDA, it's like I could be flooded with 1 million drug, stage 3 trials or something. So I just think that that's the danger, is that government just cannot serve its role, given the AI in the private sector.
You kind of already see this happening in some things. It's not an AI story, but I didn't know this until recently, but the tobacco was not regulated by the federal government, and nicotine were not regulated by the federal government until the Obama administration. It was like 2009 or something like that. Yeah, no, there was a Surgeon General's warning and there were the settlements with the tobacco companies, but the products themselves were not regulated. And there was federal stuff too. But again, that was settlement and like Surgeon General warning, but it wasn't like you needed regulatory pre-approval to bring a tobacco product to market. Now you do under the FDA, except the FDA's regulatory process is 5,000 page documents, I'm sure, that, a maker of like a vape or something, it's nicotine vape, has to submit. And the FDA can't read these things in time, right? They can't process this stuff because their own process is so burdensome that they can't read it all. What you're seeing is that our market, the tobacco market, like if you go into a store and, you see those disposable vapes that are everywhere, those disposable vapes are supposed to be regulated by the FDA and they're not. They're completely unregulated. They're being sold at best quasi-legally, and I really think illegally. And it's like an example of how our own regulatory processes have made it so that government can't enforce the law to some extent. I think you might see way more of that going forward, which is, that's state capacity declining, which has basically been the story of the last few decades in government. So, yeah.
Well, Dean, this has been awesome. I've taken a lot of your time, so I really appreciate it. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alan. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we'll be in touch further because I think you and some others are hot on these issues. It's going to be a crucial few years here.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds good, and I look forward to it.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.